There are 2 tales waiting for you, told one after the other by an odd set of 2. So prepare yourself, dear one, because this is Drops of Darkness.
Welcome to the show. I'm Anodyne Vaughn, writer and narrator of dark fiction, and me and my true storytelling co-host, Cameron Helkuik, have 2 new stories to distract you from the terrors of everyday life, at least for a little bit. This week, my story is about something that I'm a little surprised it's taken me this long to write about. A monster-worshipping cult. Let's just say I ran with it, and then kept running. Pretty far. And then after that, Cameron has a true story that really has it all. A visit to Grandma's, a cabin in the woods, and a terrifying surprise. If you enjoy our weird little show, we would really appreciate it if you could support what we do by sharing it, giving us a follow, and leaving a review. Alright, enough of all that. Stranger and someone are waiting. I am Stranger, and I tell only fantasies. Whenever your world has a grip on your throat, I am there, waiting to unleash the monsters that sleep in my mind, so that they may remind you that you have sharp teeth and claws of your own. It used to only happen a few times a month, but this was the 3rd time in a week. The metal springs under Edith's thin mattress shook as Abigail was dragged, kicking and thrashing, down the length of the dimly lit dormitory. Edith knew it was coming, but the sharp crack of the switch against Abigail's bare skin still made her sick. "Insolent, foolish child," hissed one of the usually silent all-mothers in a high, nasally voice. Like the rest of the girls, Edith laid perfectly still in her bed, not making a sound. But unlike the others, her hand gripped the edge of her thin white sheet as she tried to well up enough courage to rip it off. She'd been trying to picture it ever since the All-Mothers began emptying one of their beds every few days. How her sheet would flume out behind her before it fell to the floor as she sprang from her bed. And then what? Edith wasn't sure, but her hands tightened into fists, her jaw clenched, and as Abigail's screams melted into soft, whimpering cries, a deep rage in her chest whispered that it could show her the way. She lifted her arm and felt the fabric begin to slip from her legs. "Edith, don't." Her hushed voice barely audible over the straining and huffing of the wisp-thin all-mothers. Edith looked over at her best friend's moonlit face in the bed next to hers and met Ruth's wide eyes that were silently pleading. "We already have a plan. Just one more night. Don't risk everything now." Edith lowered the trembling sheet back over her body and begrudgingly started to coax her hand away from the wrinkled hem, when one of the all-mothers let Abigail fall to the floor with a thud. Then the woman, covered in faded scars of symbols and sigils, broke from tradition and turned to address the favored children. The Soul Father has been made aware of the recent unwillingness of those blessed to be chosen. Instead of punishment, he's granted us voice to gently remind you all of the sacred honor you have been given and the duty that is bestowed along with it. The All-Mother paused to stare pointedly at Abigail and the angry red welt that was blooming across her tear-stained face. To be silent, reverent, obedient, and grateful. To be offered as a vessel. If the next of you does not accept your mantle with grace, know that your sisters will have every comfort taken from them, so they may learn the true meaning of sacrifice. No more beds, chimed in the one with the high-pitched voice. No more doors. No more clothes. No more leaving these walls. Are we understood? Yes, all mothers, responded the girls in unison. All except for Edith, whose top and bottom teeth were dangerously close to grinding together as she bit harder into her lip. The dormitory door shut, and Edith's sheet billowed through the air. It crumpled in a puddle of white on the age-blackened floor worn smooth by the countless bodies that had been dragged over its uneven slats. Edith, don't! But Edith listened only to the sounds her feet made as she stomped towards the door, and the small voice in her chest that was growing louder the closer she got. An orange-yellow glow filled the gaps between the door and the frame, and a sweetly tinged burnt smell started leaking out from behind it. With her hand on the handle, she paused and thought for a moment about Ruth, about their plan to slip into the woods when the full moon was bright enough to light their way. She thought about the others that would no doubt be punished for what she wanted to do to the women who were tying the knots and stoking the bonfire in the field. Things that she pictured now in her mind with perfect clarity. And only the latter remained in her mind when the sound of screams and sizzling intertwined as they ripped through the silence. She twisted the dented knob and shoved through the doorway. Abigail had been freed from her thin nightgown and bound to a stone pillar that barely concealed the pile of bodies behind it. The favored children who were tested before her and all deemed unworthy. Already Abigail's face and neck were covered in the same sigils as the Allmother's, but unlike theirs, her burns were bright and pink and new. Edith watched her face contort in pain, and in the waves of heat that came off the bonfire that roared higher into the night sky, lifting the ashes of fresh blood that crackled and popped in the flames, announcing the order's offering to him. The great devourer, Almighty Imne, called the Soul Father, opening his arms wide. May you test this vessel and accept her as a doorway. Rearrange her in your image, Hound of vengeance, and free our community from our failing human forms. All mothers, cover yourselves, he said, pulling on his own thick black robe. The others followed suit, and as one they brought their hoods over their faces, turning into a black mass that surrounded Abigail. From the Soul Father's sleeve, a silver knife emerged. It glinted briefly in the orange firelight before it slipped across the girl's pale throat. The blood poured quickly and dressed Abigail's naked body in a thick red veil. Make them pay, said Edith's rage, and she listened. No one had seen her when she left the dormitory, and they couldn't hear her running in the damp grass over their chanting. The All-Mother, with the high, squealing voice, was already choking on her own blood before the rest of them took their eyes off the sky. Edith's knuckles ripped open in new places each time they slammed against the woman's broken teeth. Your hood, you're not covered. Where's your hood? Said the All-Mother, struggling to speak around the bubbles of blood rising from her throat. Edith felt hands wrap around her waist and start to pull her off. She shoved them away, but more came to rip her off the dying woman, still shouting at Edith to cover her face. Show them what it feels like, the voice told her. Clutched in the woman's twitching hand was the switch. Edith reached out and felt the rod graze her fingertips as the other All-Mothers dragged her away. Fight. Fight back. Edith kicked as hard as she could and was rewarded by the dull, satisfying crack of bone under her foot as she fell forward. And when she stood, she held the switch in her fist. Where's your covering? Asked the woman, cradling a broken nose. None of us are worthy to be seen by the devourer. Edith looked past the cloaked, muttering women at the Soul Father, who who was gathering Abigail's blood in the chalice, either uncaring or unaware of the commotion on the other side of the fire. Put an end to it. He tells them what to do. And him, said the voice. The Soul Father held up the chalice and repeated his prayer to Imne. He might not have been able to hear her running towards him, but he did finally turn at the sound of her breaking the switch over her knee, right behind him. Edith couldn't see his face under the hood, but she watched his head turn from her to Abigail, tied on the pillar, and then back to her again. Then he did something that Edith did not expect. The Soul Father knelt and lifted the cup towards her, the dark blood sloshing over its edge as he did it. Free him. The voice was all around her now, urging her fists over her head, and then, as fast as she could, she brought them down. The chalice fell from his hands, splashing Edith's white nightgown with blood. The Soul Father, still kneeling, smiled, despite the broken halves of the rod sticking out from his eyes. Finally, Imne, you have found your vessel. He lowered his head and bowed deeper until the ends of the rod scraped the ground. Tell us, what do you ask of your devoted followers? Imne was starved after decades barred from this world, but even as the drool dripped from his jaws, he waited for the voice in his chest to give the command. Devour, Edith whispered to him, and the great hound of vengeance listened.
Hello, everyone. In between stories, we like to highlight a cause that is worth our collective attention. For April, in Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we decided to highlight the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. The NSVRC enables advocates to combat sexual harassment, assault, and abuse by giving them the research and tools they need. They recognize that putting an end to sexual violence goes hand in hand with stopping racism, sexism, and every other type of oppression. You can find out more and donate at www.nsvrc.org or from the link on our website at dropsofdarkness.com. Now, back into the shadows we go. I am someone, and I tell only truth. Whenever something slithers through the barrier between worlds, I am there, not to stop them, but to watch them and remind you of the countless terrors your kind has survived, all on their own. This story was submitted by Visterious, whose Instagram handle is listed in the episode's description. In 2021, me and my close family had decided to take a road trip to North Carolina to pay my grandmother a visit for her birthday. We live in the Midwest, so it was quite a trip. Since my grandmother lives in a smaller cabin with one bedroom, we obviously couldn't sleep there, so we rented a larger cabin a town over. After we had spent the day having a good time and celebrating her birthday, the sky started darkening, so we decided to head out in order to make it to our cabin before it began to be too dark. This cabin we were staying in had lied deep in a mountain, which had been extremely hard to drive up to, as it was not only steep, but muddy. We finally made it to the cabin, but not before it had turned dark out and slightly raining on and off. The moment I had stepped inside, I felt a gross and off-putting feeling, but I had just blamed that on the dark atmosphere in the mountains. The clock was ticking and everyone had been getting ready to sleep. I was stuck with having to sleep on the floor while the rest slept in beds. I could hardly attempt to even sleep due to the inability to be comfortable. I decided to try and use the restroom and wash my face in hopes when I got back I could finally sleep. The bathroom had been just across from where our room had been in the hallway of the cabin. The cabin was dark and silent. I had snuck into the bathroom, and on my way back to the room, once I stepped in, I turned around to shut the bathroom door behind me. Something stopped me. I stood there, hands still on the doorknob, and eyes gazing up. What stood in the doorway was a large and thin being with an abnormally large head. This figure was not human whatsoever. The proportions were deathly and off. The waist was too skinny and the ribs too wide. The fingers were just below the knees, it seemed, yet I didn't recognize any facial features whatsoever. When I noticed this figure, I felt my blood run cold. I finished shutting the door in a rush while shaking. The moment the door clicked into place and finally shut, my brother woke up screaming in agony. Some background history. My brother was 20 at the time, and when he was younger, he suffered from sleep paralysis and night terrors. But he hadn't experienced something like that in 7 years. This utterly freaked me out, and I was unable to fall asleep at all that night. Is this just all coincidental, or is it truly something more and on the paranormal side? I had to receive therapy after this event, and I was unable to sleep on my own for a while due to all of this as well. Although this may seem a bit dramatic of me, I have an OCD diagnosis, and I quite frequently picture that figure and remember the gut-wrenching feeling of the situation and the fear of it coming back.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Drops of Darkness, which is written, voiced, and produced by Anodyne Vaughn and Cameron Helkuik. If you enjoyed your drift into the shadows, help keep the stories alive by sharing the show, leaving a review, and if you really want to earn the favor of these dark storytellers, tether yourself to their world by tapping subscribe. If you have a true paranormal story of your own that you'd like to be read by someone, you can make the offering to submissions@dropsofdarkness.com or through the form on our website. Until next time, dear one, and remember, when the darkness looks your way, hold its gate.